One of the, like this morning when I came in, I ended up worked out and then I showered at the church, and I realized I didn't have like my shower bag, so I had to like kind of make do. But I didn't have any like hair product. The reason why I say all that, I started thinking about. So if people don't see my fuzzy hair, that's why. No, but I started thinking about. I was like, you know what? Like, there's so many comforts that we just get used to having. Like, so even deodorant, I had to go find deodorant in my workout bag and different things. But I was like thinking about in life, if I had to get rid of just one of the like staple comforts. So I made a list. So I'm gonna ask you guys. So if you had to get rid of one of these 6 things, okay, you had to pick one to lose, and then well, if we have time, well, what's the number one thing that you would keep? Okay, so if you had to get rid of one thing, indoor lights. Indoor heating. So you could heat your house, but like the convenience of like a thermostat heating, cooling. So lights, heating, cooling, indoor plumbing, indoor gas or electric to cook. So you would have to by fire, and the last one is refrigeration. All right. So lights, heating, cooling, indoor plumbing, indoor cooking, and refrigeration.
Which one would I get rid of?
Which one could you get rid of that? Would you say, you know what?
Indoor plumbing.
I would say get rid of lights, man. I could light candles all over the place and be fine. I like that kind of, ambient light.
Chris you said it so fast.
Plumbing.
I need to know, man. That's like such a major thing.
I was gonna say plumbing would be like game over, man.
I know.
Nah, I spent enough time camping. I'm good.
Man, what kind of camping are you doing, man?
When you're backpacking, there's no bathroom.
You're talking about like
haul up
like
a bucket from the well,
Yeah.
then?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I mean, is that what you're using to get water?
Create an outhouse.
Oh my gosh, man.
I mean, they did it for, my grandparents still had an outhouse on their property when we were kids. So we're talking like 1980.
So I guess, are we including in plumbing like water lines, right?
Yeah.
Like, man, I think that's like one of the ones I would say I definitely would not. That might be like my top.
That's interesting. Okay, so your lights.
I could get rid of lights. That's no problem. I mean, you got windows during the day, like at nighttime, lighting some candles and stuff. I like that anyway. I think that'd be kind of cool.
I think I would get rid of air conditioning. I mean, like, I love air conditioning, but of all those other conveniences, I like flipping a light switch.
Really?
I mean, I could do candles, but I like the light switch. Yeah, I want heating. I hate being cold. So I want heating. Yeah, indoor plumbing. That's not even an option, Chris. All right, so what your number one then? What's the number one thing you love the most? Like lights, heating, cooling, indoor plumbing, indoor cooking, refrigeration.
I'm definitely keeping refrigeration.
Yeah.
I want the access to food for long periods of time.
I said that would be rough. I mean, you think about how much stuff you put in the fridge that if you didn't have that.
Yeah, all I'm going to say is like whenever you have a refrigerator break, you realize how inconvenient it is, right? Or a cooler go out or something.
Yeah, I would say I still think plumbing would be number one, just for like, only because, I mean, recently that our well pump went out and you realize legitimately how many things, just not having water, like you can't do anything. I mean, it was unbelievable. So even not having it for a day or two would
According to Chris, you still can do stuff. You can go and you can dig a hole.
I mean, seriously, even your toilets though, like you can't get water to them, but like you're talking indoor plumbing, you're talking about the actual drains itself. So that plus the water, there's no way. That's my number one.
Yeah, plumbing's my number one.
Refrigeration would be number two, probably.
So refrigeration is number one for you?
Yeah, air conditioning is number two. I hate being hot. Like, I can't sleep if it's too hot. So it's like I gotta have air conditioning.
Yeah, that's a really good question, though. That's rough.
Yeah. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our podcast. This is The Branch. Every week we get together, and sometimes we talk about Sunday's sermon. Sometimes we pick other topics. Today is an other topic type day, and what we're going to be talking about today, guys, is mainly difficult relationships, not just relationships. I think one of the most common questions in some form that we get is, who do I have to be in a relationship with? How do I handle the tensions, like all of the dynamics? Because I do think to some degree, there's an idea that if I'm a Christian, then that means I have to love everybody. And by love everyone, I have to be friends with everyone. I have to hang out with everyone. Like there's that mindset. And so I want to explore that today. Is that biblical? Is that practical? Obviously, the most important thing is it biblical? But is it practical? Like, what does it look like? So that's kind of where I want to begin. So I want to begin with just the first overall question. Do I have to be in relationship with everybody?
Yeah, I mean, this is, even as we briefly mentioned that this was going to be the topic for the day, I was, thinking about it. And I would say, number one, I don't think the Bible does demand that anywhere. I mean, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount he makes a reference to how, this idea, this contrast in the kingdom life where Gentiles will, love those that love them. And if you only do that, basically you're no different than them. And he compares the same thing, if you greet only those that you know. So there is this sense in which we're supposed to be, I guess you would say friendly, for lack of a better word, in that we're supposed to be welcoming, inviting as ambassadors of the kingdom. But I think it's different to say that realistically means we're going to be in relationship. I mean, being in relationship and being friendly, being kind, even being willing to go out of your way to serve a person, those are two different things. So I would say the short answer is the Bible never commands anywhere that we're called to be in relationship with everybody. And I would say, secondly, even from a practical level, it's not realistic. I mean, you think about your own life, you only have so much bandwidth and capacity to have deep, meaningful relationships with so many people. And so I would say there is a dynamic, though, within the church when it comes to relationships. I think where we get it backwards, and we'll probably unpack this a little bit more, in American society is we actually, I think that the church, so those who we would call brothers and sisters in Christ, the body of Christ, that our relationship with those individuals is actually supposed to be, I would say, top tier. Apart from your marriage, if you're a person who's married, I would say your relationship to other believers is up there as, hey, this is really supposed to be really a majority of now what you see your family as, your friendships. And so I would say in American culture, that's probably a lot lower on the list for most people. Right. But to answer your question overall, I don't think realistically we can have relationships with everybody, and I don't necessarily think that's what the Bible commands.
Yeah. I tend to think it falls in the line of like the level of relationship or the degree of relationship with which we're in people. Like I can walk up to somebody on the street and I'm called to be Christ-like to them, whether I know them or are in a relationship or not. Am I called to be their best friend? Maybe not. And I don't think the scripture says you must be best friends with everyone. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I even think about the context of the church. Like, I don't know that the calling is to be best friends with everyone.
Sure.
It is to bear with one another, be in, you know what I mean? Care for one another, help each other, which there has to be some level of relationship, but not to the degree that that relationship plays out. I think there's a lot of flex there. So yeah, that's kind of where I think about it.
Yeah. So let me even define the question a tad bit better. So you answered what I was saying, but I think oftentimes that the tension isn't so much, do I have to be with friends with every single person? Because I think we realize that's not realistic. That's not going to happen. But do I have to continue to be in a relationship with someone I at one time was, and maybe there was some tension, maybe there was a fallout? Do I still need to be in relationships with them? So, so as you guys think about that, I mean, like when I think about it, one of the things that's interesting when you look at Jesus and what he modeled, Jesus strategically or had strategic relationships. So we see in Scripture that there's the masses that followed him. We see in other capacity, there's the 120 or so, like it's mentioned in one spot. There's another where he has the 70 he sends out. You go down to the 12 disciples that were closest, and even within that group, there was his core, the three. And so you see, like there was a strategy to it. To somehow, he never defines what it was that led him to do that. But Jesus was comfortable realizing not every relationship was going to be the same.
Sure.
And there was even passages of scriptures where like Jesus would not entrust himself to people because he knew what was in the heart of man. It says that in John 3. And so like there were times that Jesus knew like this group I have to protect myself from. He knew very well that the Pharisees were set out to trick him. So he approached them differently than he did other groups. So there was a lot of wisdom in how he treated. So he wasn't just opening himself up blindly saying, yep, I have to be in a relationship with everyone.
Right.
But like, again, I think a lot of people, it's the tension of like, I was in a relationship, this person did something. Do I still have to? Like, so we'll unpack it more, so you don't have to go into a long answer. But what's the kind of the short summary answer? If I'm in a relationship with someone, is it possible that we just won't continue to be in a relationship, and that's okay in the eyes of God in the Bible?
Yeah, I think again we have to define when because I think in relationship, depending on who you're asking, what that means is going to entail different things, right? So being in relationship with them. So yeah, are we talking about saying hello? Are we talking about hanging out on a regular basis? Are we talking about texting? I would say overall, there's going to be people in your life that when they hurt you, when they do something, maybe they demonstrate that they're a person who's not trustworthy. Maybe they gossiped about a conversation you had with them, they slandered you, talked behind your back. I mean, there's every option available that most people have experienced in some form or another. And I would say, no, the Bible doesn't demand that you be best friends, to use that language, with that person. The reality is, yes, we're called to forgive. We talk about this idea before. We're called to forgive. We should be people who are always striving to reconcile if possible. And so this gets into even the conversation around conflict and confrontation. How do we do that lovingly? How do we do that with wisdom? How do we even think about that? Because there's another component of it is, if this person is a Christian, it is the loving thing to do to confront behaviors in their life that is dishonoring to the Lord and has hurt you. So there's an element of that that's even a part of this, where some people would say, well, I'm just going to ghost them. I'm not going to talk to them anymore. I'm not going to address the issue because I don't want to be confrontational. Because even in the minds of many Christians, confrontation is seen as evil or wrong, which I don't agree with. I think the Bible tells us we should lovingly confront issues when a person is in error. And so there are those components. I think the short answer is no. Yes, we're called to love. We're called to forgive. We should be people who are striving for peace, striving to reconcile. But there are times when a person shows themselves to not be trustworthy, or to be a person that, compatibility wise, maybe there's just some things. I mean, that's the other practical side of it. There are just some people, personality wise, maybe we don't get along with great. And there's a wisdom in maybe realizing that. Doesn't mean we hate them, doesn't mean that we wish ill towards them. You can still love a person without being in close proximity to them.
Yeah, I would just say this. I don't want to reiterate what Anthony said, but if you have done those things of relationship where you've confronted them and you've told them the grievance that you have with them and they don't respond, I don't think there's any obligation to continue that relationship or continue to give the energy that relationship will take. Will you need to release them to God and forgive them? I do believe that there is a level of that has to take place, but that doesn't mean that you have to continue to allow yourself to be taken advantage of, to be abused at the most extreme level. If they are offending, if they are offending you, are not willing to change, you're okay to step out of that and say, I release this relationship. I really want to be in a relationship, but not at this degree, with this amount of hurt, and it's not helpful.
Yeah. I remember years ago, I came to a realization that when I first came to it, I kind of struggled with it because it felt unbiblical in the sense of just kind of what I naturally thought. And the realization I had was, I don't think the Bible teaches that we are called to forgive every single person. Now, as I say that sounds shocking, but what I want to define it is, if someone asks for forgiveness, we are called to forgive that person, like 100% of the time. What I looked at in Scripture was all of the times where God commanded us to forgive, it was conditional upon repentance or someone coming to you. So even like when Peter says to Jesus, how many times must I forgive my brother? And he's like, 7. He thinks he's hitting a home run, and Jesus goes, 7 times 70. Like he just blows out of the water. He's not giving him a literal number. He's just like, whatever, all these times. But even in how he said, he goes, if your brother comes to you this many times in one day, you forgive him. But the reason why I came to the realization that we don't have to forgive was, I don't think that's how God treats us, in the sense of the sins that are forgiven are the sins that are confessed and repented from. But here's what so whenever I would say that, people would be like, oh man, like almost, I remember talking to one person, they were almost like, oh, good.
Like relieved.
But here's the key. We are still always called to love a person. But not in our American idea of love is too connected to our feelings. So our idea of love in America is, I have to feel good about that person. We think of love in romance and friendship. But when you look at the biblical love, like agape, it's more of that like commitment to the betterment. So like I'm going to be committed to your betterment regardless of how I feel about you. But the reason why, and I say all that to say, the reason why I think this is healthy is there might be a time where I can't release you of that debt. That's what forgiveness is. I can't release you because if we are going to be in relationship, we have to acknowledge this. We have to address this. And that's like what you were saying is, like, you go to the person and they might not have the capacity or the desire in that season. And so you don't just release it, but you go, man, I'm still going to be committed to you. I'm still going to love you. But if they come to you one day and say, like, I want to be in a relationship, it's like, okay, I want you to know I still love you, but I need to address this issue. And I think that's really healthy and biblical. But I think a lot of people, like you were saying, like they think conflict is bad or unbiblical. It's like, no, it's not.
Right. And we've we've talked a little bit about this before. I think the way that I would use like my language around it is distinguishing between the concept of forgiveness and reconciliation, right?
Yeah.
I think there's an element where we are called to give this person to God, right? If you have anger, like I don't think it's ever right as a Christian
For sure.
to be holding anger in your heart, resentment in your heart towards a person. So there is a sense in which I would call that like first tier forgiveness, where we are giving that person over to the Lord and we're saying, God, I don't want to feel this way towards them. I do genuinely want to love them. I want their best, but I'm also able to recognize they're doing certain things that are hurtful to our relationship and are making it so that our relationship is no longer possible, which is where I would say it's helpful to think in terms of forgiveness and reconciliation, in that Christians are called to be people who strive for reconciliation, but there's never necessarily a command to be reconciled in the sense that another person has a part to play in that. And so there's an element where you can't be commanded to do something that's not solely up to you to do. To be reconciled to a person means that person has to recognize if they've done some harm to you, if they've hurt you, there's a boundary there to say, I'm not going to exist in relationship with you if you continue behaving in this way. So for that relationship to be reconciled, to be mended, they have to be willing to acknowledge that. They have to be willing to repent and say, I acknowledge that. I'm sorry. I don't want to do that anymore. And so then the relationship can move forward. So I do think there are tiers to this in the sense of in the way that we view a person, in the way that we view relationships. We're always called to love. We're always called to release a person to God. That doesn't mean being dismissive of what they've done or sweeping it under the rug. Because I think that's where a lot of people are, where they think the loving Christian thing to do is just kind of pretend like it didn't happen. And I would say, no. Number one, you're missing the opportunity to push them towards Jesus and to recognize their sin, but also you're not really doing any real service to your relationship, because that behavior is going to continue if you're not willing to acknowledge it.
And where I was coming from when I mentioned that, the whole idea of being able to release them is, I think there are times where you're right, where it is dependent on their repentance. What's tricky is us as human beings. God is perfect. We are broken. And I think it's very hard to be in a posture where you're willing to forgive them if they repent, if you've harbored all of this frustration and anger. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, 100%.
So like that release, or what I was terming forgiveness, is that level of letting go of, not letting go of the hurt in that it doesn't need addressed, but allowing God to heal your heart in the meantime and give you the posture that God would have. If this person comes back and repents, I'm not going to hold that against them. What you guys were talking about, the examples I think of, I know many couples who got divorces, and I know we're going to talk about marriage a little bit more here in a second, but they got divorces because of behavior by one of the parties who was an alcoholic or whatnot. And so they got a divorce because the behavior of the person who had problems drinking was so devastating to the other person. It was not wise for them to be in a relationship anymore. What needs to happen for that relationship to be restored, if it can be restored, is the drinking needs addressed, that behavior needs to change, and then there's the possibility of reconciliation. And so like, you're right. Like, you can't have reconciliation without the addressing of the sin and still continuing to have that moment where that person goes, will you forgive me for this behavior?
And I want to be clear, what I'm saying too about forgiveness is, when you can offer forgiveness, you should. And I don't think you always have to have the other person fully acknowledging it to offer forgiveness. So I wasn't saying like we need to be legalistic in that sense, because I would say the average relationship, if you give it enough time, there's going to be a lot of things that offend you that don't need to be addressed. If you're that person that has to address every little thing, you're hard to be in a relationship with, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, I think you alluded to it too. It's like, if in every relationship, we are biased, and there are times we don't have total understanding of it. So like we will fill in the blank. So like I can look at someone's behavior and be offended by it. Another person can look at it and not be offended by it, because we just processed it different. So if we're thinking like, no, I'm 100% correct all the time, that arrogance leads to a lot of destroyed relationships, because I mean, how many times have we all done this in our marriages where you say something and then your wife comes back and is like, that's not my heart at all. And like in your mind, it was like, not only was that your heart, you intentionally did this to wound, you know what I mean? And like, and your wife's like, no. And then they're like, is that how you act? And you're like, no, but so you have to be able to give grace and to understand we have a broken perspective.
Yeah. That was what I was going to get into as well. Like you saying that you have to reflect on the type of person that you are, in the sense of, am I a person who is charitable in my approach to people? Do I give them the benefit of the doubt? Do I always assume the worst, or do I assume the best? Am I gracious where someone maybe talks a little bit too much and they go a little bit too far? Am I going to cop an attitude? Am I going to give them the cold shoulder? Am I not going to text them back that night because they, you have to consider these things. Is that the type of person that I am? Because if you are, I would say what Christ would say to us in those moments is that we have a responsibility to play even on our side of that relationship, right? A relationship is two parties. And so we want to be the type of person that offers grace, is charitable in our approach to people, in the sense that we want people to do the same to us. And I know we've talked about that before, but it's so funny how we want grace from people, but we have great difficulty offering grace to others. But I do think and I'm glad you brought it up, I do think there is a tiered system, if you will. There are some behaviors and some actions that are things that need to be addressed, right? This is not something you just kind of sweep under the rug and let it go. There are other things where it's, I'm highly sensitive today, or maybe I got my feelings hurt or whatever, that I probably need to deal with personally more so than bringing this up and addressing it. But there are other big things that this is an actual problem that this person has, a behavior, a pattern, a cycle that is detrimental, it's destructive, it's dishonoring to God, and it's hurtful to the relationship that I need to address.
Yeah. I was going to say, and not to step the conversation back to your initial question, but there are people in my life that just grate me in certain ways, and my personality just doesn't mix with them. You know what I mean? And what I find though is that God brings those people into my life at the opportune time to teach me how to be gracious and to teach me how to operate in a godly way.
Sure.
And so we have to be careful. No, we don't have to be best friends with that level of person, but I think there is, if we always just shut off and say this person rubs me the wrong way, I'm not ever going to talk to him, we're missing out on an opportunity for God to teach us what it means to love people that are different than us. And I think that's an important piece of it. So
have you ever met a person, I know you guys have, but have you ever met a person that they're annoyed by everything and they almost wear it as a badge of honor, oh, this bothers me so much, this and that. And they think somehow because they're able to point out this annoyance, you know what I'm saying?
It's like a superiority complex.
Right. Yes. And there's oftentimes when I'm around people like that, when they say the thing that annoys them, in my mind, I think that says more about you than it does them. But I noticed as I started to think that, I started to realize that's true of me. Because there are times that there are things that I realize in a moment disproportionately annoys me than other people. And there's a part of me that wants to get self-righteous, get on my high horse, oh, that bothers me. And all of a sudden I started realizing, and you guys have probably been around me enough to hear me say it. At times I'll go, I know this says more about me than it does the situation, but that bothers me. But I mean that genuinely, where I'm starting to realize, good grief, man, I need so much grace in my life. And all the things I think I'm right in, so often I find out I'm really not, or I don't have the full picture and stuff. Okay, so here's a really tough question. And this will be tough because you guys can get as personal, as vague as you want, okay? Well, I mean that generally because, I know our families might watch the podcast. So I'm going to talk about families. I think a common question that we get is, when we think about relationships, are there some relationships in our lives that need to get priority? So you said it earlier, and I was going to get to it, and so we can get to it now. We do know biblically that the Christian relationship needs to be a priority, and it's oftentimes not. But I think people wonder, is my family, my biological family, do they get a biblical priority in my life? So because God allowed me to be born into this relationship, where's the cutoff for there? Because if I have a toxic sibling, a toxic parent, a toxic child, whatever it might be, and I'm not talking marriage. We're going to come to marriage later. So leave that one on the side for a minute. But what is my responsibility to them? Am I in it for life because I was born into the family? I mean, I get that question frequently. What do you guys think? What are the relationships that should get the priority? How do you define what relationships maybe have more responsibility than others? Are there any that feel that way? Or are there just general truths that cover all relationships?
I do think that there is a level of priority where, and I know you said not to talk about marriage, but I do think the marriage relationship gets first priority in all of that. And then immediate family does have some semblance of importance. And I mean, you see Jesus, he says, who are my mother and brothers, when his immediate family comes after him. and he's talking about the disciples. He's talking about the people following after him, and so you get this sense of like immediate family is important, but we're to love the body of Christ the same way that we love our family. And oddly enough, Jesus extends that to enemies, and so like. And not oddly enough, but like hard, in a challenging way, that's a difficult thing. So I think as I think about that, like I think we have to operate and treat each person in the same way that we treat every relationship, where we go like, is this person's behavior? Now, obviously, if you're a parent and you have a kid in your home that is not of age yet, like
You can't kick him
out of the house. You know what I'm saying?
This dude just is not listening to me. He's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
biblically, you're out.
But I think that there are relationships with adult children that are toxic and need to probably be like you need to create some space in that. And that's I can't imagine as a father myself, like I can't imagine ever doing that. But I can think of situations that would bring me to the brink of it. You know what I mean? And would take me to that place. But I think that there is just this priorities I have a hard time answering that question as directly as you asked it. So,
Okay.
But
Yeah, I would say apart from marriage, which I know we'll get into, so you have obviously some commands in the New Testament, like the household codes, particularly in relationship, not only to marriage, but like, fathers and sons and some of those dynamics. So I would say, yes, when you have kids within your household, part of what it means to be a godly father, godly mother is the way that you relate to your children until they're at a place of adulthood and independence. And then I do think there is some change in that as far as what your responsibility is. Obviously, we would still here on earth love our children and always want to relate. I mean, Micaiah and I talk about this all the time. Like to us, a huge win as parents is that when our kids are adults, they still want to be around us.
Right.
Like, that would be a huge win. And so we desire that, but I would say from a responsibility standpoint, yes, there's a uniqueness to that relationship now as a father, as a mother, to what we're called to do as faithful stewards of God's grace in their lives and to love them and to serve them and to lead them and to teach them all of those things. Obviously, the other famous one, and this is where I've heard people ask, because this is a really difficult one, the classic, even from the Old Testament, honor your mother and your father. That one, I think, is where there's some lack of clarity, because when you get into adulthood, what does it look like? Clearly, we're not talking about obedience. We know what the Bible says once a person is married and you create a new family, right?
Let's slow down just for a second, though, because you said obviously, but for some it might not be as obvious.
Sure.
So unpack that just for a little bit. So Bible tells us to honor our fathers and mothers, but what you're saying is we leave our father and mother and cleave to our spouse.
Yes.
Using a King James version there.
Cleave. No one knows what cleave means.
Explain that, though, for the person, because we do see at times parents that still manipulate their children, even into adulthood, because the kids feel an obligation to respect them or honor them, and they think that means obedience or deferring to them, but there very much is a biblical idea of you're stepping out from under their authority, and now the relationship looks different. So unpack that for people, because I think that is the tension that a lot of people have is like, I respected my parents, and now I find my parents they're hurting my marriage.
Absolutely.
Those types of things.
Yeah, so I think when you do step out and you are now forming, in God's eyes, a new family, right? Like when you are married to another person, in God's eyes, this is a new family, a new institution. And so your first priority now does become your spouse. And so obviously Jesus is number one, your spouse is number two. And so that is a new dynamic that's at work there. And so that becomes your first ministry, your first priority. I think the other dynamic that works with that, though, is when, as you said, when a parent, a father, mother is bringing some level of unhealth into your life personally or your marriage life, the question is, how do you handle that? How do you respond to that? And again, this goes back to really what I would say the idea of conflict and confrontation, almost redeeming what that is, because there are people that would say to actually have conflict with my mom or my dad, to confront them, feels like I'm disrespecting them, which I would say, again, is almost a childlike way of thinking about it, right? In the same way that if your 8-year-old son or daughter were to kind of talk back to it's almost that same paradigm, which I would say no longer applies in adulthood. So the question is, what does it mean to honor your mother and father, especially if they're acting in a way that's toxic, in a way that's hurtful, in a way that's dishonors God in a way that hurts you. And so this is where I would say you get into the conversation of conflict and confrontation, that it is a loving thing. Both grace and truth should be the embodiment of all Christians, in that there are times where we have to draw hard line and boundaries, again, especially if your marriage is now your first priority.
Right.
If my parents are hurting my marriage, I have to be able to draw a hard line and a boundary to say, I'm not going to allow anything to derail what God has called me to do as a husband, and for many as a father, mother. And so part of that is having a conversation and being honest and saying, these are behaviors that are destructive. They've hurt me. They've hurt my marriage. These are the things that need to be addressed. And then I think you go from there. And it does fall into the same category that I would say anyone else does at that point. I don't think there is any special category at that point for your mother and father, in the sense that they don't get special access, even if their behavior is unhealthy or dishonoring or disregarding the way that God has called us to live and to operate and love one another. And so I would say, to bring all that home, really the only unique relationships would be, in your marriage, when your children are in your household, and ultimately when you are under your parents' household, and then how that kind of moves on into adulthood and when you're married yourself.
Well, even thinking about the whole idea of honoring your parents, like the context of that is the ability to care for them and see them function through life when they cannot sustain themselves anymore.
Sure.
And so, and the biblical command falls within a context that would have allowed for families to stay together. Like you think about Abraham, you think about Isaac and Jacob.
Sure.
Like they all lived together,
right,
in one tribe, clan, like in one area. And so you have this idea of you honor them by caring for them, allow them to continue to operate with your family.
Sure.
But you get to this context, it looks completely different. You know what I mean? And so what does it look like to honor your father and mother? Well, if you're having conversations with them and they're not willing to understand where you're coming from, I think you do. Yeah, you create those boundaries.
Yeah.
But the understanding of, but the heart should still be, I think the heart is always, again, reconciliation, always caring for and fulfilling that call to even honor and care for the extended families that you have. And I think, and I don't want to give too many details. Here's the part where you're just like, don't give how much detail you want to give. I think about in my own life, there are things that I've worked through in being adopted into my wife's family, and there's things that she's worked through in being adopted into my family that we have had to go, this is different than the way they operate is different than how we're going to operate as a family. As we've made those distinctions, there are growing pains, but I say all that to say my heart for her is always to have her honor, knowing how important it is for her. I want her to be able to honor her mother and father the way that she feels led by God to do that. Yeah. So as our relationship together, that is part of it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So I have to work through inconveniences, differences, things that annoy me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
For the purpose of allowing her to function in the way that God's calling her to function as a daughter. Same thing for me. And she does the same for me. And so I think it's always that heart of, how can I honor and serve the other person? Unless they're being so blatantly beyond annoying to hurtful behavior, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Sure.
Then we have those conversations, I think, that you were mentioning. So,
okay, let me frame it and see if this registers with you. What I'm hearing you say and Anthony say, so the relationship transitions to a point, but then it turns into somewhat of a calling in the sense of, you have a unique connection point to parents and in-laws in the context you were just talking about. And sometimes we realize this, because this can be true not even with people that we're related to. This somehow God brings them into our lives, and we can use any term we want. They can be difficult, they can be annoying, they can be high maintenance, whatever. But we know that this is a calling. Do you guys have relationships like that? Okay.
Yeah.
Who? No, I'm just kidding.
Not my in-laws. I want to make that clear right now.
Right, but I'm saying but I would say it's similar in the sense of, on one hand, you go, this is a relationship that I might not naturally have, but God brought proximity, and so now I know it's a calling. The same thing with in-laws and your own biological family. As you get older, you go, I can't ignore the fact I was born into this family, so there is proximity that God brought me there. And so this might be a calling. And I think when we, does that make sense what I'm
Yes,
saying?
100%.
And so I think sometimes we have to process and ask that way, God, how do you want me to respond in this specific relationship? Because I would say that's one thing earlier on when we're talking about high maintenance and difficult relationships that we can't avoid is there are times that God absolutely tells us to stay in certain relationships.
Sure.
And I actually had that in my notes to ask you guys, again, I'm not asking you to name names, but can you give a general example? Are there relationships in your life that God has called you to and you realized in my own personal preference, I probably would have stopped this relationship and or avoided it, but because God called me, I'm going to step into it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to make every relationship in my life insecure. So
Yeah, you're just saying yes. Okay.
Yeah, no, I would say absolutely. And I'm glad you guys pointed out, not to derail this particular question, but I think there is levels of, even the question about, okay, how do you relate to your parents? I was giving an example of like an extremely divisive relational dynamic, right? Where a parent is doing very, very unhealthy things. But of course, if that's not the case, we're not talking about annoyances. We're saying, well, I have no obligation to love or have a relationship with. That's clearly not what we're saying.
Yeah.
I think even Paul in the New Testament, he references like the concept of being worse than an unbeliever, the person who doesn't take care of their household. So there is a specific call, to use your term there, that the people God has brought in close proximity to us to love them and to serve them in a unique way, but not necessarily, there's a point where for some of them, there's no obligation outside of kind of the external social pressure that, well, they're your parents or they're this, so you have to do it. I do think, yes, there are unique times where God brings people into your life and you're able to recognize almost that this is a relationship maybe that's not for me. So it feels very one-sided in that I don't feel like I'm personally getting any benefit, but that's the nature of love as a whole, right? That Jesus himself gave up his life for our benefit. And so there are times where absolutely God brings people into your life where you think, man, this is not an easy person. This is not a person that I even necessarily get along with, but I do feel a specific burden to love them and serve them and to represent Christ to them in very tangible ways.
Yeah. And I'll say this, like if I find myself in my heart going out of the way to go around somebody, typically that's the person that God's like, hey, you probably need to not do that and spend some time with that person. Because what it does is expose something in my heart that's broken that needs healed. And God is using those relationships and those opportunities to teach my heart, to teach my life that. So
For sure.
So
there's that other passage of scripture, hopping back to taking care of your parents, where Jesus rebukes the Pharisees because they had created basically their own legal system where they said anything that they dedicate to the temple, they don't have to give to their parents. And so they were using it to basically prosper themselves, not have to take care of their parents. And he's like, basically call them hypocrites.
Like
rebuked
a temple tax write-off.
Yeah, basically. And he was like, just so they didn't have to take care of their parents. And he was saying, no, that dishonors the heart of God. Okay, so now I want to transition a little bit. We talked about the different types of relationships. Let's just talk about on a real practical level about conflict resolution and or confrontation. I think a lot of people have never seen it modeled or been taught good confrontation. So the reason why I think it does feel unbiblical for some is because the way they do it is unbiblical.
Yeah, sure. The way
it's explosive. It's angry. It's mean words. If someone was like, okay, I'm hearing what you guys are saying, that there are some things you have to address. What does that look like? So let's talk through first, like the heart prep, as I'm thinking through, how do I know what needs to be addressed versus what needs grace? How do I prepare? What do I do? How do I, schedule a meeting with that person? What does that look like? I mean, even practical stuff, because I think some of the stuff we've dealt with so much that it can seem like to us, I'm not saying this to be condescending, but it can seem like to us common sense, but I don't think it is for all people because they haven't seen it modeled well. And so like, how do I address it? Is it like a spontaneous surprise? I got to confront you on things. Is it schedule a meeting? Do I write him a letter? Is it through text message because I'm comfortable in texting? Like, let's talk through some of those things. So let's first, let's go to the heart side of it. How do I know when I need to address it versus something I need to ask or just to release and give forgiveness to?
So my personality is not, healthy confrontation was not modeled well for me. So it was something that like I was averse to. I would say it that way. I've grown to understand the importance of it and learning how to do it well. So if in my heart, I feel like I want to confront this with somebody, I have to check my heart first, because what it means is that I'm furious and like I'm to the place where like this is not going to be a healthy conversation or reconciling. So the very first thing is if I don't want to address something but feel the absolute need that I need to, but I'd rather not, that's usually a good sign to me that this is something that I know I need to take the time to address with somebody. Because now I've removed my frustration, my annoyance out of the equation and allowed it to just be something that this is the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think there is a level of self-awareness in this. Like if we're talking about this and writing a playbook on how to do confrontation well, I think the first aspect absolutely is like introspection, thinking about, okay, what is going on? What's the thing that's upset you? And so like even to give marriage, I mean, we're all married and we all understand the dynamic of marriage. There's going to be things that your spouse does, for example, that are annoying but aren't sinful, right? And so you could be confrontational about that, say, you never do this, you're always so messy, and get into a big fight about that. Or you could say, okay, I realize I'm wired a certain way. This is something that bugs me. I can get over it and just do it the way that I think it needs to be done and not cause a problem, right? So there's a lot of things like that, not only in marriage, but in friendships and quirky things that all of us have that another person might think is annoying. So I think you have to examine that. Like, is it something, number one, that is inherently sinful? Like this is a behavior that before God objectively is wrong. Like it's something they should not be doing. And if that's the case, it's something that I would say it needs to always be addressed, you know, in the context of the relationship. So even talking about vehicles or mediums in which we're using to communicate these things, you have to say, okay, well, what is the context of the relationship? Is it a spouse? Is it an adult sibling that you see once every 3 months? You know, I mean, I think depending on what that relationship looks like, that is going to dictate how you respond. If you're living in a household with them versus you see them, you know, once in a blue moon. I think even though the concept of confrontation, as you were talking about it, number one, even when you hear people talk about this, you'll hear them talk about it in terms of this is a confrontational person or this is a non-confrontational person. It's like these two categories that both, in my mind, are unhealthy because the confrontational person is usually aggressive, not very kind, not very tactful, oftentimes not even doing it out of the right motivation. The non-confrontational person is, as you kind of said, averse to it, and they don't want to have the hard conversations that will ultimately result in hopefully good fruit. It will result in reconciliation. It will result in conversations that build greater relationships and intimacy over time. So I think even part of the way we talk about confrontation needs to be reframed. The way that we think about it is almost entirely wrong in the sense that we have those two kind of categories and neither of them are good. So I think the middle ground is being willing to speak the truth, but being willing to speak the truth in love, as Scripture says, offering grace where we can offer grace. But there's an element where we've talked about this before. Number one, going back to introspection, I would say, are there any wrongs that I need to acknowledge? Right? Is there anything that I've done in this context, of the context of this relationship, that I need to own up to first? And I would say always lead with that. Always lead with humility. Always be the first person to apologize and ask for forgiveness, even if you're in the midst of a conflict and you only own 5% of the 95 or the 100% of the problem. You know, even if you're the small percent, start with that, lead with humility. I think that's going to go a long way in showing proper motivation and heart that, hey, I want this relationship to continue. This is not just me pointing out or pointing the finger at your wrongdoing or your problem without acknowledging my own issues and what I've brought into that. So I think that's a big one. And then, I think posture and tone, that's the way I would word it, to whether it is in a text message, whether it is in an email, whether it's a letter or it's a face-to-face. I would say always opting for face-to-face if possible. Because there's so much lost in translation through text message. We've joked about this even in the office before, right? When someone sends a text message, there's times where it's ambiguous. Like, I don't know if they're mad. I don't know if they're upset. I can't.
Man, I've messed up on that one so many times.
I think we all have, right?
Just texting where, like, I found out that, like, all the younger staff, my text was like freaking them out because they would send me something like, is it cool if we do this or that? And I would answer yes, period. Like, I always put punctuation. And so, like, I could literally in my mind go like it's yes, period. And they read it as yes, period. This conversation is over. Like,
it meant like a reluctant yes.
Yeah. And they were like, really like, oh man. And then I found out, like, I thought that was like silly almost. And I asked my kids, and my kids said it would bother them too, where they would ask, can we go play basketball? Can we go out to a movie? And I would go, yes, period. And they would talk to each other and say, is dad mad? And like, that was so funny to me, because I'm like, I said yes. I said yes to the thing you wanted to do.
Yeah.
And then Molly, my assistant, said the one that took her a minute to figure out was when I used the term sure. And
It goes either way.
yeah, I guess to her, she was taking it as like,
I guess so.
Sure.
If you really need to.
yeah, like almost annoyance. And I was like, she goes, I like, as much as I know you, I didn't think that would be the case. You know, that's not how you typically respond to stuff. So now that's become a joke. If she texts me, like, I frequently, if I can, I go, sure.
Yeah.
You know, sure, period. I put sure, period. And she's like, she'll put like a smiley face or whatever. But yeah, anyway, so we're just saying, a lot is lost in digital communication.
Yeah. I think the idea
And you're
is,
way more aggressive in digital communication. I think.
Yeah, for sure.
More bold.
Yep.
I was going to say some of the preparation part of it is your personality too. I think if you are more towards the averse side of things, I think you should take time to prepare what you want to say,
good.
because you can get in that moment. And I don't know how many times I've done it. I don't know how many conversations I've had. Your adrenaline still goes. And like you get in that moment and your adrenaline's going, like, and if I could control it, I would stop it. But you know what I mean?
Right.
But it's just a natural response of being in that situation. So what preparation ahead of time does is just gives me clarity of mind. I know exactly what I'm communicating. I know why I'm communicating it. And it just allows me to relax in the moment where I'm not trying to think on my feet, where I know that's not my personality.
Yeah.
And so like that's something that I think is important. If you need to write it down ahead of time, that doesn't mean you communicate it through that medium.
Right.
But write it down, write your thoughts out, even create bullet points if you want to bring notes to the meeting. I think that's a good thing to do.
I've used the combination of that where I have so I'm naturally an external processor. So like I'm fine kind of on my feet in a conversation like that. But because of what you said, I wanted to be as specific as possible to outline an issue. But I've done the kind of 1-2 punch combo where it's like, I want to send this in a text, but then the follow-up of, I would love to meet to discuss this further, so that I can kind of almost go over, hey, this is what I'm trying to articulate to you, kind of remove any or emotional response from that, so that I can almost proofread and say, is this how I want to say it? Is there anything in here that can be misconstrued? But in addition to that, I want to follow up. I want to have a conversation. I want to sit down and talk through this.
Yeah. That's it. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the other thing I try to do is I would say I'm learning how to do, and I fail at this one with my kids all the time. I start from the guilty until proven innocent. Yeah. Where I'm learning how to ask questions first. And what that does is first it informs me to greater detail what's really going on. So if they've done something that I disapprove of, it makes them either tell me that they've done it, or if I can read through like they're making excuses about it, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it just gives me more information about the situation, but also it just disarms the moment. Like, and now I'm not coming to accuse you. I'm coming to a place where I'm allowing you to explain yourself and giving you the opportunity to say like, that's not how I meant it, or you know what I mean? Yeah. So many conversations have been diverted or de-escalated because I go, hey, did you do this? Did you mean it that way?
Yeah.
And when they say no, you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
It's good.
I said that in the sermon this past week when I was giving examples of things I've learned, changed my thinking. And one of them I said that it's better to ask questions and make assumptions. And I'm the same as you. The place I've noticed it the most are in the relationships that matter the most to me, and it has been with my kids, where I've come in like gangbuster. You know, I'm fired up. Like, you did this, and to have them explain it to me and immediately know they're telling you the truth, and you feel like a total jerk. Like, I've had that a few times where I'm just like, I don't like that feeling. And so I've learned now, like, instead of coming in hot, just ask some questions. And then there are times that I'm like, okay, I was right. And then we have to have some consequences. But I have learned that it's just better to start with questions. It always is. You were saying earlier about the person. I'm going to give my thoughts on this. About the person who is a little bit more adverse to confrontation, writing down thoughts. I'm going to give a suggestion to people. If you're on the other side of it, and I think you were going to go there, if you're kind of a hot temper, I'm confronting everything, you should take some time too. Yeah. So on both sides, take some time, organize some thoughts. Here's my suggestion to both. I used to do a podcast by this name, but coming in with the posture of I could be wrong is critical to have a healthy perspective. Because here's what I've seen. I've seen people that have come in from the hot side when they're fired up and, and they're just not open to listen. They're not ready for it. And like, there's too much almost emotional investment to even come down from it to say that, oh, I'm wrong now. And so it's really difficult. But I've also noticed on the other side, people who have to really gear up to finally confront, they're so nervous and their adrenaline's going that their brains almost shut down too. And they come in and there's almost just like this, I got to get through this. And they're not listening. It's super hard.
Yeah.
And so like, if you can come in as best you're able and just to relax enough to say like, okay, I want to learn. I could be wrong in this. You might be 100% correct, but there might be still ways that you can communicate it. You might learn from it. And I think that's critical to it. Okay. So heart posture, get in the right spot. Let's just get even a little bit more practical now. If a person is going to confront because, they need to, what does that look like? Is that a like schedule a conversation? Do you let the person know ahead of time what the conversation is going to be about? What you got any suggestions with that?
I would say yes. Yes, you need to schedule the conversation, and then also let them know ahead of time. I've tried both ways, and it always works out better just to be like, hey, this is what we're going to talk about, and this is why we need to clarify what's going on. For one, it allows them to prepare their hearts and minds, because what it does, God goes before you in that moment and might do something in their heart. Or it gets them more upset, and then you know what I'm saying? Like I don't want to paint it like it always works out that way. But or it makes them nervous, and it just gets. But at least gets them thinking about like, oh, this is something that we need to.
Yeah, because so few people are great on their feet. Like when you just show up and go, I want to address this issue. You're a good chance is you're going to get the worst initial body language back because you just put someone on their heels.
Yeah, they're going to feel ambushed. Yeah. So I think it's a way. I mean, that's one of the ways I would say to extend grace to them is to actually and to really just to be honest with them versus the kind of feels like a bait and switch. Hey, can we grab lunch? And then you just dump on them all this stuff that they're not prepared to even walk through. So I think always leading with honesty and openness and even being charitable in that to say something to the effect of, if it's a severe situation where you say, hey, this is something that's been going on and it's really hurt me. But I care about you. I love you. I really want to figure things out and work through this. I think just being open and honest with people always respond best with that. And as you guys said, it does give people time to prepare themselves and even maybe be more introspective for themselves to think through some of that stuff that you may be initially addressing on the front end and then are able to get to more in person. And that's where, again, you're able to be a little bit more open and honest and they can see the vulnerability and even just your facial expressions and all that stuff to where it's not lost in a text message and they take it the wrong way. But I think always trying to be upfront and honest doesn't mean you have to address the entire issue on the front end, but I think being open and honest about what you're trying to get at is a good thing.
Yeah, I would suggest as you're making statements with that person too, that you don't make just sweeping statements. You always do this. This is totally you.
Sure.
It is really helpful to say statements and frame them in the way, this is what it seems to me. This is how I felt when you did this, so that it doesn't feel attacking. And there almost is a questioning element to it of saying, basically, correct me if I'm wrong. It has like that tone to it. And to make some statements and then allow the person to process. And I would say when a person speaks back, to acknowledge and give ground where you can is critical. Michael Giacomoni taught me this. I would watch some of his interactions like through social media, especially during like right after the COVID season, there'd be some really hot topic issues. People would come in so hot with him on different things. And he would be so kind to them and would give ground 100% of the time where he could. Even at times where I thought like, I don't know that I would have given ground, not compromising in any like negative way, but where he would just go, oh, okay, I see what you're saying there, man. I probably could have done that differently. And in my mind, I was like, Michael, you were fine. This is obviously that person, But what he was doing was like, and then you would just see people, if they were at a 10, they're like down to an 8. Then the next comment, they're down to a 6. And by the end, they're both being kind. And I was like, wow, it was like so redemptive in the way he did that. And I think I've learned that too. If you can just give ground where you can, it just says this is a safe place. I really do think if you go into a meeting and you are so locked into a spot, you're basically promising or guaranteeing that person has to lock into their spot too. And now you're just at war. And so giving that ground, I think really helps.
That's good.
Okay. One of the things, the areas of confrontation is sometimes you're in a position where it is your responsibility to confront. I think as parents, we're called to confront. For us as pastors, we're called to confront. For me as a boss, I'm called to confront at times. Speak to that for a moment in your guys' lives of how you process that as a parent, how do you process that as a pastor, where it isn't, even when it goes against, like you said, like you were kind of naturally not a person who leaned toward confrontation, but you've had to as a pastor and elder. And I've seen you grow to where now you handle this as good as anyone I've seen in my life. But you had to grow to get to that place. What had to happen in your own mind and heart to become comfortable as much as you are doing it? You guys get what I'm asking?
Yeah. For me, I had to come to the place where I go, this is the best thing for our relationship. It's the best thing for the church. It's the best thing if it's at home. This is the best thing for my kids. This is the best thing for our family. And so, like, when I can rationalize and put my mind around, because just as much as I was a verse, I'm also a rule follower. And I also, like, when I recognize that something's good, like, I want to do that. And so, like, those are the things that I've had to process through to get to the place where, like, okay, so this is a necessity. This is something that will bring life to this situation. And it might take a while to get around to the blessing of it. So it might go bad at first, but even because that's your mind, if you're averse to confrontation, you go to the worst case scenario first. This person never going to talk to me again. They're going to hate me, defame my name across the, you know what I'm saying? Right. Like you go to the nuclear option of like, it'll be the most terrible thing in the world. And if you can just walk yourself through and get to the place where, like, even if it goes that way at first, like, I trust and believe that the Spirit of God is working in their heart and mind. He's working in my heart and mind. And we might have to revisit this a couple different times, but it will be worth it in the end. It will take us to a place of life and health. So.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I would say so. One of the ways we would probably define love is to fight for the highest good of a person. And I would say that there are just times, whether it be your own children, whether it be the people that you're leading, to fight for their highest good entails confrontation. Like, there are certain things that they're doing, behaviors that they're participating in that are not good for them. And so to love them well means to confront harmful or destructive behaviors. I would say the second part of that is, it really, to me, is a stewardship thing. Like, God has entrusted that to us. So there is a duty in it as well. And it should be a joyful duty in the sense of, again, God has entrusted to me to lead my kids and to love my kids well, or to lead my staff, or to lead the people of this congregation. All of that is really a joyful responsibility that we get to participate with God in. And so there is a faithfulness aspect of being a good steward of what God has entrusted to me, to say, to not discipline my kids, to not address these behaviors, is to not love them well. And it's really to be disobedient to God, because I'm called to do that well. And the same for the church, the same for the people that God has entrusted you to lead. I think you have to reframe it that way, to say, and of course, the New Testament is full of these references, particularly in the church. I mean, Jesus in Matthew 18, there's this element when a person sins, when a person, again, we're not talking about this person just maybe does something that's kind of a little bit annoying or quirky. We're talking about doing things that are dishonoring to God or are harmful. I do believe it is our responsibility to do that. And a lot of people in our society will shy away from that because of this bad assumption of what confrontation means, or what it, what they think in their minds that entails. But it's supposed to be redemptive, right? It's supposed to be to the glory and honor of God, but also in the name of love, wanting to serve that person the best. So I think if you reframe it that way, hopefully it would give us a little bit more confidence to want to be able to do that.
All right, I want to end with three separate situations, not completely connected, but just want to touch on them before we go. We alluded to this one numerous times throughout, but there is a unique calling for us as Christians to prioritize Christian relationships. Can you speak to the biblical context? You've said it in numerous ways, but kind of in the passing of making other statements. What does the Bible tell us about prioritizing Christian relationships, and why should those be a priority?
Yeah, I mean, the way that the Bible talks about, particularly the New Testament, talks about the church is it's the family and household of God, right? We're the bride of Christ. So even the language of brothers and sisters, I mean, that's conveying a powerful truth. It's actually saying, though we have biological brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers, that you have now been grafted into this new family, the household of God, where God is our Father and we are siblings. And so the imagery of the New Testament itself, I would say, just lends to that. Like it's alluding to that. And then you just have very clear instructions, even about, the gifts and the concept of serving one another, loving one another. Really, majority of the commands of the New Testament, even where Jesus talks about loving one another, is actually a reference to inside the church. It's this idea of we are brothers and sisters. We're part of the family of God. And so the way that we interact with each other, the way that we love one another, matters immensely, because we're representing Christ on the earth. And so to not prioritize those relationships, really, to be blunt, is to not prioritize Christ. And this is why I think all of us would agree. I think it was John Wesley who originally stated something to the effect of, the Bible knows nothing of solitary religion, to those who have this idea that you can just be kind of a rogue Christian disconnected from community. That's not at all the biblical picture. And so to not love God's people is to really disregard so much of the New Testament. But everything that we see, I would say, in the New Testament just points to this idea that you are a part of a new family. You alluded to this earlier, where Jesus himself says, hey, they come to him and say, your mother and your brothers are looking for you. And he says, who are my mother and my brothers? Those who do the will of God are my brother and sister and mother. I mean, that's a powerful statement. He was in that moment elevating those relationships, those individuals, even over what would have been the social norm, especially in first century Jewish context of the family household. So I think we have to understand everything that the New Testament is conveying is absolutely, like, the church is your family, in the sense that you are now a part of something that is eternal, above just race or biological family and all those other things that we prioritize, and again, are good things, but should never take the priority over the body of Christ.
So Chris, speak to, why is it then, in light of everything Anthony just said, why is it so important for people to make it a priority to reconcile within the church? Because there is we see it in the rhythm of modern day American Christianity, is if someone at my church offends me, whether it be a pastor or another member of the church offends me, I'm just going to go to another church. Why is that so damaging to both the church and also the individual who's being offended and leaving?
It says that the healing and reconciling power of God is not working, and it's not effective. So, like, I'm in a class on mission right now, and we're talking all about, like, a lot of this stuff. One of the key witnesses of the church and of Christians is the ability to walk in unity, because Christ's mission was to reconcile the world to himself. And that means you have all these different, distinct, diverse people that are gathered together under the banner and under the power of the gospel of Christ. And so when we live in unity, we are demonstrating to the world that the gospel is true, that it's real, and that Christ has the power to bring life to ourselves. So when we choose not to reconcile relationships in our church family, when we choose just to kind of let things go, it's essentially just allowing division, and it's a testimony to the lack of priority or the lack of power that Christ has. And or at least that's what we say. It's not that that's really the case, but that's what we model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. All right, great answers, both of those. Let me switch now. I have two topics left. There are times where someone wants to have a deeper relationship with you than you want to with them. Not in the sense of they're offended you, no, I don't want to be friends anymore. But there are just times people, they want a deeper relationship than you can offer. You don't have the bandwidth for it, the time for it. What would you recommend to someone, how to handle that situation? I mean, I know in our culture, it's like you ghost them, right? Or, but that can feel very toxic. But maybe, is that the best thing? So, I mean, again, what do you guys think, both in experience, but also biblically?
Yeah, I would say, again, just going in the same vein of always wanting to be gracious, always wanting to be as charitable as we can be. I think you can be honest in those situations, where I've been in this season of life with young kids. There's just some things like I'm not super flexible about, with my time. And I'm honest with people about that. Part of it for me is even an opportunity to say, hey, I really value wanting to put my marriage and my children first. Like, they're in a season where I feel like I need to be there. And so I need to prioritize this. There might come a day where, least not for my marriage, but for my kids, that changes a little bit as they get older, as they grow more independent. So I think even just being honest about that, I've never had a time where a person hasn't even resonated with that. They're like, I totally understand that. Yeah. So I think there's that component of being honest, but even just being honest in how much you're able to give this individual person. Yeah. So say, hey, I would love to get together more. It's just honestly at this point in life, it's probably not realistic for us to get together more than once a month or whatever it is. I just think being honest, always leading with that, is honoring to people, and things then at that point are not able to be misconstrued or read in a wrong way where you just don't like this person, or as you said, you're just ghosting them, or people fill in the gaps like we all do. We'll fill in the gaps for ourselves. I think being honest is always a good thing.
So I was just going to ask a question, and I'm going to throw you on the spot. What if you don't like the person though? What if you, and when I say don't like, I use that term incorrectly. And what I mean is like, it's a person that you're just like, I just do not connect with this person, and I do not think that I can.
You're asking how much honesty do you give a person like that?
like
I just don't like you. I really don't want to hang out with you.
But I mean, like how do you, like, that's one that I've always wrestled with how to handle, if I can be 100% honest. I don't know how to. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I'm asking a question here, throwing things off.
Well, that's tough.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've not really experienced that. I think most people, not all, can pick up on that over time. Like if you're not reciprocating, right? Like it's one thing. If you're not constantly reciprocating, reaching out to them, trying to hang out with them, most people, not all, are going to eventually pick up on that and understand that. But again, if the situations that have come close to that, I think even just with what I said before, I don't think you have to get specific to the details of even why you're not able to lend yourself towards them in relationship often. I think you can keep that part vague because you don't want to hurt people's feelings, but there are just real practical times where, you don't jive well with the person. You don't have a chemistry that's natural there. And you can just be honest though, with what you're willing or able to give them as far as your time.
Yeah. I mean, I've had just being a person on stage in leadership as the lead pastor and primary communicator. I've literally had people come to me and say like, I feel like we should be best friends. Like they've used that phrase. And sometimes it's an obvious no. I mean, in a sense of like, we don't know each other. And honestly, that kind of is an aggressive way to start. So there's some red flags with that.
Yeah.
But I've had to say to people, and I mean it genuinely based on what you were saying, is at this season in my life, my relationship tank is full because I have incredible responsibility to my wife and kids. And then all my other relationships are the pastors I work with, the people I'm connected to, and my friendships. And I just can't give it to you. So in my mind, it could also, I could have other steps in that list where I could be like, and also this and this and this, but I don't need to say all that because my initial answer covers it. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so that makes total sense.
All right. Last question is kind of like a similar thing though. Okay. What if you realize I've had this relationship and this relationship now needs to end? So whether it be this person is toxic, this person's a bad influence on my life, this person's offended me so much and they're not really reconciling. Do you tell that person that? And if so, what does that conversation look like, knowing that like if they've already done something that's hurt the relationship, they're probably not going to respond well? How do you handle that tough conversation?
You want me to start?
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've been in situations like this. Where whether it's for a long season that relationship ends or if it's just kind of like indefinitely. But I would say the work up until that point is very important. So I would say, have you gone through all the things where God calls us to do, to try to be a person who's reconciling, to be honest in our confrontation, to be gracious in our confrontation? Have you done all of those things? Because when you do that to a certain extent, you should be communicating. There are certain boundaries that you have you've broken these boundaries. You've broken this framework for how a relationship should be operating. If you continue to do that, I'm not going to be able to continue in relationship with you. So I think there comes a time where for some people, they're not responding. They're not moving towards you. They're not willing to acknowledge whether with their lips or with their actions, the behaviors that they're doing that is being harmful to the relationship. And so at that point, I think there is no obligation, I think, to continually give excuses for why you can't be in a relationship. It's, hey, I've communicated to you on the front end what has happened. You have continuously not responded positively to what I've brought to you. And at this point, like, I just don't see our relationship moving forward anymore.
So that conversation still might be tough, but it should never be a surprise.
Absolutely not. No, that's what I would say. To be faithful to what I think God instructs us in His Word, it should never be a surprise. And oftentimes, if it is a surprise, I think most of the time that comes out of a place of resentment, where we're angry, where we're fed up, and in a moment we make a rash decision. And I don't think that ever should be the way as Christians we operate in relationships.
Yeah, if it ends like a 7th grade dating relationship, it shouldn't. Something's going wrong. You know what I mean? Like, you should have the conversations ahead of time that lead to the place where you are. It's the end, last ditch effort, I guess, is the way to think about it in my mind.
Yeah.
So.
Well, great. Do you guys have anything else you want to add?
I don't.
Well, great discussion, guys. I always appreciate you guys' time and wisdom. Thank you for joining us. It really does. We're honored by it. It's not lost on us that you could be watching other things and listening to other things. So thank you for connecting. And always, if this is a blessing to you, share it, because we want to encourage other people in their faith. So we love you guys, proud of you, and can't wait to see you on Sunday. God bless.